It's episode 212 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please click on the link in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Russell Blake and his book Day After Never, Blood Honor, the first book in the post-collapse series that Hugh Howey called the best post-apocalyptic series I've read in ages. When the world ends, I hope this book survives. Can't wait for the sequel. Well, you don't have to wait because you can get into the series now and read all 6 books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, Pico's House. Hey, authors, are you looking to take your book to the next level? Talk to my friend Crystal Pico Watanabe from Pico's House. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, and proofreading. She'll soon be launching a book interior design service, print formatting, and things like that. But you can inquire about it now. She's edited over 70 novels and novellas and 130 short stories. And she comes recommended by best-selling authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta. Most of her experiences with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle-grade fantasy, but she enjoys all genres and will do you an awesome job. She offers a complimentary 2-page sample edit and complimentary track changes review after the edit. PicosHouse.com, and let her know you heard about it on Author Stories. Also, Dominion Rising is finally here. 23 all-new, never-before-released epic novels of fantasy and sci-fi, all for only 99 cents. This set is the talk of the industry right now, so grab your copy before you're left behind. Dominion Rising. There's a link to it in the show notes. Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. This raucous sci-fi adventure introduces Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. He and his friends channeled his anger and grief into the ultimate weapon against alien technology. Human emotions were the one thing the Kron didn't account for when they started their attack on Earth. Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are now available. Galactic Satori Chronicles. My friend Stefan Boltz has a new book called Six String. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mixed in poverty and a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toil becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved six-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that can rob her of everything she's won. Six String by Stefan Boltz. Also, Series 2525. In Series 2525, you fly along on the sci-fi action adventure of Ceres Tari, a 25-year-old playboy superstar of the Zero Gravity League. He's desperately searching for his mother, long held captive among the galaxy's 500 worlds. When he too is kidnapped by a pirate fleet, forced to duel to the death to save a slave with powerful secret abilities, he determines to fight his way up the pirate ranks. Can Ceres kill his father to rescue his mother? Who will save his soul from himself? Fun science fiction with heart, Series 2525 is the must-read book of the summer. Don't miss out. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, my good friend R.A. McCandless, his book Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1. A child of angels and humans, Dell is a sarcastic, fast-talking, dangerous, and unpredictable demon hunter. She and her partner, Marin, take their orders directly from an angel. They obey, or they'll be destroyed. It's not the job Dell wants, but it's the job she has. Normally, banishing a rogue demon back to hell wouldn't be a problem. Dell and Marin have a few centuries of experience. It's all part of the job description. But when the angel orders them to take down 3 demons at once, the job goes from bad to worse. The demons with supernatural powers and their own agenda have kidnapped children for their own nefarious ends. With angels breathing down her neck, children to save, and demons gunning for her blood, Dell is running out of time. That's exactly where she wants to be. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is urban fantasy at its very best. Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1 by R.A. McCandless. Visit edgosney.com. If you're a fan of comics like I am, you need to go check out Ed's blog, Cool Comics in My Collection. Ed goes through his massive collection of comics, gives you some information you might not have known about comics and the way some of these storylines go. He also will bring out some trivia that you can use at dinner parties. Ed's blog is great. You'll love it. Cool Comics at My Collection. He goes through ones that he owns, some that got away, and brings out the very best in comics nostalgia, and some brand new ones that he's collecting now. edgosney.com for Cool Comics in My Collection. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' Jason Crane series, and thank you to all the sponsors for making the show possible. Now on to our show. Today's show is with Jason Rekulak, and when I recorded the show a couple of weeks ago, I had a horrible cold. We kind of joked about it before we recorded. I was not feeling my best, so Jason and I had a great conversation, but if I'm a little out of it, that's why. I wanted to mention, we didn't talk about it in the interview, and I wanted to bring this up, but Jason's website at jasonrekulak.com, he's done something really cool at the site. The book, The Impossible Fortress, which is really how I discovered Jason and wanted to get to talk to him, is the book is based around this game that a teenage boy and girl in the 1980s, kind of they formed this friendship around this game that they make on their Commodore 64. And Jason has recreated the game that's playable on the website. So go to his website, jasonrekulak.com. And there's a link to it in the show notes. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Now on to my interview with Jason Rekulak. Today I'm really excited to have Jason Rekulak on the show. His new book, The Impossible Fortress, is kind of my latest obsession. I listened to the audiobook over a couple of days, a week or two ago, and just absolutely fell in love with it. So I had to trace Jason down and ask him to come on the show, and I'm so excited to have him with us tonight. So Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
You know, I have a fun answer to this question. When I was about 10 years old, this was 1981, I was reading a lot of Mad Magazine. I was really into comics, and there was a boy in my neighborhood named Jeffrey, and I went to his house one day, and we went down to his basement. It was the first time I'd been there. And I guess his father was a sales rep for a paper company. And he had this sort of supply room down in the basement. And I remember Jeffrey took me into the supply room, and his dad had all of his sales samples down there. So, like, you sort of have to picture a room with all these shelves, and they're just full of pads, you know, like pads of all different sizes, 4x6, 8x10, blank pads, line pads, thousands of pads. And he said, you know, if you want any, take whatever you want. My dad lets me use as much as I want. You know, we got more paper than we know what to do with. And I have a super vivid moment because I don't think I'd ever been to a stationery store. We didn't have like Office Depot or anything back then, you know. So I was doing like, I might have written like little stories up until then, but to me, I saw all those blank pads and it just looked like books that were waiting to be filled, you know. And so I grabbed a handful of them and, you know, turned them sideways so the top of the pad became the spine of this book, and I started, you know, making my own comics and things like that at age 10. And I would try to fill these pads with comic stories.
Oh, that's amazing. You grew up in Pennsylvania, is that right?
No, actually, I grew up in New Jersey. I've been in Philadelphia for, a long time now, almost 20 years, but I grew up in central Jersey.
Okay, I was going to ask you if that was Dunder Mifflin that your friend's dad worked for.
No, I don't know the name of the company.
So you started drawing your own comics, and kind of what things were you interested in at that time?
Well, you know, I mean, again, because I was just a kid. I was like 10. I was reading Mad Magazine. I thought that was very funny. So I was doing my own, you know, movie parodies and things like that. Like I would do these Jaws comics about Jaws the shark, you know, I think like Land Shark and Saturday Night Live, all that stuff was going around. And so, you know, these were not serious literary aspirations. I was just trying to do things that would make my friends laugh. And, you know, I'd bring them into the cafeteria at school and, you know, hope for an outrageous reaction, you know?
Right.
I was definitely to my peers, you know? So
I was also 10 years old in 1981, and I remember doing very similar thing. A friend of mine and I would make these comics about one of our teachers that we had. We turned him into a superhero, but a very kind of a bumbling superhero, and it was awesome. That's a great time for that, I guess.
Yeah.
So, did you when did you know that you wanted to pursue writing as a path? Maybe not a career path, but as something that that you treated more seriously and knew that this was going to be some part of your life.
Well, I mean, as I got older, it's funny. I heard you discussing this with another writer. I sort of grew up in the sort of place where it was not something you would seriously consider. Like I was my dad was a construction worker, and so like the idea of saying, well, I'm going to be a novelist, it was, it seemed ridiculous and impractical. And so I also was not really a great student in school either. So, but what happened was, and this comes up, this is basically material that I drew upon for The Impossible Fortress, is I sort of, computers came along, home computers came along, these really simple microcomputers like the TRS-80 and the Commodore 64. And I got my hands on one of those, and I started playing around with text on screens, and I felt very comfortable doing that. I felt like, that was sort of within reach, and that's not, that was the future. Everyone knew there was going to be money in that if you could do it.
Right.
So as a teenager, I started to teach myself how to code and how to make video games, and I sort of took all that creative energy and I channeled it into that. And I'd write these games, you remember this stuff, like the games graphically were very primitive. You'd have these sort of stick figures who'd run around. But my games were always prefaced with long stories. You'd have screens and screens and screens of history telling you the backstory of these characters. So I was writing, at like 14, 15, 16, 17, but I never told myself I was writing. I was like, well, I'm making games.
Right.
That's what I'm doing. And so my friends thought it was cool because I was making video games. And my parents thought it was great, because they're like, yeah, keep programming, go to MIT and you'll get rich.
Right.
So,
yeah, I had a very similar experience, but I wanted to make adventure games,
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that was huge for me. That there was, I've talked to a couple of different people about this, and growing up in the 70s and 80s, I think you and I are the same age, and for me, there was just something magical about that time. I've talked about this before, that my kids have all grown up with computers all around them. They all have phones that are, crazy powerful compared to the stuff we had. And they're just appliances to them, but there was a real sense of discovery and just something magical about that time, that you had this machine and you could make it do what you wanted to do. Kinda, or at least in our, in our imaginations, it held limitless possibilities. And I'm kind of sad that my kids don't have that same experience that I had.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it really was, I feel lucky that I came up with it, or that I came of age with all that stuff. And I had that sort of same sense of discovery, and that I basically was able to experience life before the internet.
Yeah, exactly. My wife and I got married in 1994, and on our honeymoon, I picked up a book about the internet, and I had always been a computer nerd, but I told my wife something like, I could see this is going to be a part of our future, and I had no idea that everything that I do would be, on the internet and be possible because of the internet, 23 years later. It's insane.
Yeah.
But at what point did you realize that you were not going to be a programmer and you weren't going to go to MIT and make your parents proud?
Yeah, well, so, I went to college. I went to Penn State as a computer science major, and still with the plan in mind. But, I around that time, I sort of knew I wanted to be a writer, but I was still like, well, I'll do the computer programming in the day and I'll write my books at night. That seemed like a good practical plan. I knew I had to get a day job. And but as I moved through college, maybe, I don't know, the second year, first of all, I took some great creative writing classes as like electives that were fantastic. And, I realized that I didn't, somehow I figured out at a very late age, it's like it took me 19 or 20 years old to realize this, that I could just write stories with pencil and paper. I didn't need to be, writing them in Pascal or Fortran or assembly language or whatever I was using, that I could just do it with pencil and paper. And I had a couple great English professors who were just, very supportive. And so I switched from computer science to English. My parents were devastated, you can imagine. And but once I did, the funny thing is that I lost all interest in coding, lost all interest in computers, gaming. I don't play video games. Like I just sort of quit at like 20, and I just threw myself into books, and I threw myself into writing, and so that's what I've been doing with my life ever since. So when my wife despairs over how many video games our son plays on the Xbox, I tell her, I was like, I was like that too, but then like one day it was like hitting a switch.
Right. What kind of things were you writing at the time when you switched over to be an English major?
Oh, let's see. What did I like? I mean, I was imitating a lot of people. I mean, I think I was coming out of like a Stephen King phase, so I'm sure I was like imitating some like lurid like Stephen King kind of stuff. David Lynch had just sort of like arrived, like, with things like Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks, I think had just come on like when I was in college. So, that was, God, I mean, that stuff was just so incredible. So I knew a lot of people were trying to do like what David Lynch was doing and like writing workshops and things. But all different kinds of stories. I was just experimenting a lot and imitating a lot.
What did you wind up doing when you got out of college?
Well, so when I got out of school, I ended up getting a job. It's kind of funny. I moved back home, moved in with my folks, didn't know what I was going to do, and I tell young people this. Coming out of school in '94, it was just very different than the world is now. And I remember coming home and opening up the New York Times classified section. And there were pages and pages of ads, little tiny ads, so like hundreds of ads, maybe more than 1,000 ads. And the heading of the ad was just college graduate. They didn't care what you studied. You just needed to demonstrate that you had gone to a college, and that was all you needed, and show up. And one of those postings was at St. Martin's Press in New York City. They're in the Flatiron Building. And they had just done The Silence of the Lambs, the Thomas Harris novel, which is a book that I loved. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try to get a job there. I'm sure it'll be impossible. But when I showed up for the interview that day, they had 3 different jobs available.
Oh, wow!
And so they gave me a typing test, and I was in.
That's amazing. What did you wind up doing?
Well, so I was assistant to an editor there who had a pretty large imprint within the company, so typical editorial assistant. You're doing a lot of clerical, administrative stuff, and I don't want to say too much about it because the editor's still there, but it was not a good fit. Mm. One of the things that happens with those jobs is you don't know who you're going to get paired with. You're going to get paired with somebody, and sometimes you'll end up with like the mentor of a lifetime, someone who's going to take you under their wing and teach you everything there is to know about this business. And sometimes you're going to be in a different situation. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, it was not a good fit for me. So I was there for maybe a year and a half. I jumped over to Book of the Month Club. This was pre-Amazon, right? Nice. So Book of the Month still existed, and they were still mailing, little packets of mail to your house every 3 weeks. I got a job there as a copywriter. That was a wonderful job. Every 3 weeks, I'd get a stack of books, and I had to write these little descriptions of them for the catalog. So, I was in my 20s, and all these amazing books were landing on my desk every 3 weeks, and I got to keep them.
Oh, that's like a dream come true. You leave college and you're surrounded by books and people pay you to read them and write synopsis. That's amazing.
No, it was wonderful. And at the time they were owned by Time Warner. So there were wonderful benefits, great health insurance, wonderful place to work. But here's what I remember. One of my most vivid memories about this job and one of my last assignments there was the marketing person came to me. And she said, there's this new thing called Amazon, and I want you to write an ad that says that we're really easy to use. We, the book club, are really easy to use, and Amazon is just too complicated. And they'd already commissioned the illustration for this ad. It was a man in a pith helmet slicing through the Amazon with a machete. And the headline they wanted the ad to say was, "Come out of the online jungle and come to the simplicity of the book clubs." Now, I don't know if your listeners remember how the book clubs worked, but here's how it worked. Every 3 weeks, they'd send you this big packet of ads, and you'd have a card in there that you had to mail back if you didn't want the book they were going to send you in another week. But if you forgot to mail that card, you would get the book, which you'd then have to pay for or mail back to them in order to get the book that you really wanted. It was very complicated.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I on Amazon, and I'm like, well, I don't know, this seems pretty easy. I click the button, and they send it to my house. So I wrote the ad, and she came back to me. She's like, nope, this ad doesn't look good. They look easier than we are.
Because they are.
And so I did it 3 times, and by the end of that assignment, I was like, I don't think this is going to work out. I don't think I have a future here. And so
had an existential crisis over Amazon.
I started looking for a new job. I was like, wow, this is not. They are not long for this world. And they're back in a new. And I loved working there. I thought it was amazing, and it was an incredible company with an incredible history. They had a tough time transitioning to the 21st century, but they have. They're back online in sort of a new incarnation. And it seems like it's doing well. So, and they choose really good books.
Have they featured The Impossible Fortress yet?
Well, yes, they have. That was a wonderful moment because I felt like my life had come full circle.
For sure.
And I don't think that anyone there knows that I actually was employed there at one point. I think it was just sort of circumstance.
Well, that's even better, though.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, that's so cool. When I first discovered your book, The Impossible Fortress, I fell in love with it, fell in love with the characters and your writing style and everything. And then later, I discovered that you were a part of Quirk Books, and then this whole other thing opened up for me. How did Quirk come to be, and how did you get involved with this?
Yeah, sure. So this is shortly after the book club, and I had left New York. I moved to Philadelphia, and I did that because I was pursuing a young woman that I wanted to marry, and I did. And we've been married 17 years now. But so about 17 years ago, I ran into a guy at a party named David Borganick, and this is 1999 or 98, and so it was like startup time. Everybody was doing like these website startups, crazy. Everybody had a website, and all the money was going into startups. And he wanted to start his own publishing company. And I guess I was like still young enough. I think I was only like 28 or whatever. I was like, oh yeah, let's do that. I'll come work for you. Let's do this. And so, okay, so now picture like, 3 or 4 people in a dumpy room in Philadelphia. And it's like, well, okay, what are we going to publish? How are we going to get anyone to send us books? It's impossible, like there's this misconception that, the universe is just teeming with like brilliant unsold manuscripts, and they're just out there for the taking. You can go around and like pluck them off trees. If you had written a truly amazing book that was commercially viable, why in the world would you trust it to these 3 or 4 people who don't know anything, and who have no like name recognition and just a shoestring business and no budget? So what we did out of necessity was we would sort of come up with crazy ideas for books and then find authors to create them. And they always had to be super high concept, because we're like, well, we're not going to get, Jonathan Franzen or Lori Moore or whoever. So the authors were sort of besides the point. What was important was the title and the cover. Things had to be really arresting and fun and irreverent. I think the irreverence just came from like the Mad Magazine stuff. And so one of the first books that David did was this book called The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. This was a book that showed you how to like fight crocodiles and escape from quicksand. And the writer's job was simply to just, call the crocodile guy at the zoo and just say, hypothetically, if I had to fight one of the crocodiles, what would I do? And the zoo people were like, oh, I'd love to talk about this, or call a Hollywood stuntman and just sort of say, look, if I had to jump out of a moving vehicle, what's the best way to do this? It was all crazy stuff you'd see in TV and movies. And
but it was actual research that went into it.
Genuine research. Yeah, there was always an expert behind every worst case scenario, and
that's amazing.
And so, of course, the byline on the book, author names are very, very small, because that's not really the point. The point is you're going to get all this really cool information. And had the good fortune of publishing that book in '99, right as Survivor came on television, the first big reality show,
nice.
Right as Castaway came into movie theaters with Tom Hanks and the volleyball. And so the timing was fantastic. Big bestseller, millions of books sold. And it basically created like a pool of money for Quirk to exist. We never needed venture capital. We never needed investors. We always had worst case money. And for years after that, every dumb mistake we made was like papered over by worst case money. It's sort of like it paid for a whole education in publishing as we tried different things, and sometimes you fail and sometimes you succeed. But we never had investors breathing down our back, and so we've always been able to stay independent. So
that is so cool. It's like everybody needs a worst case scenario when they begin their business venture.
And it sure helped. I gotta tell you, I mean, I read about Pixar. I think Steve Jobs, I never knew this. He invested some $50 million in Pixar before Toy Story came out. Think about that.
Yeah.
You too could have Pixar, but it took $50 million to get there.
That is crazy. Yeah. The idea that anybody could do it in their garage. Well, maybe if you had Steve, pumping money in, that right. Sure helps.
Yeah.
Oh wow. So obviously, Quirk was off to a good start. And did you guys when you had the success and you kind of became a force to be reckoned with? Kind of how did you craft what your your guiding principles would be, or how did you set the direction for the company after that allowed you to go on and do all this other great stuff that you've done?
Well, I mean, it's funny. The direction we chose, it sounds very sort of noble and idealistic, but really, again, it was like done out of necessity. The idea was we were going to do things that we felt were sort of, strikingly unconventional and original and innovative. And that was just, again, it was just born out of necessity. Like if we were going to do fantasy novels, well, you know what? Tor is already doing that. Del Rey is already doing that. If we're going to do romance novels, forget it. Harlequin's already there. How in the world are you going to get attention for that? But, we were like, well, we're just going to do things that conceptually are just so out there. You can't ignore these books. We did a book that we translated from the Japanese. It was a bestseller in Japan called Crafting with Cat Hair, and this, honest to God, is a real book. You take the hair of the cat, you iron it into a kind of felt, and then you use that felt to make little cats, right?
Oh,
and
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. And, again, you put that title on the cover of a book, Crafting with Cat Hair, and people can't ignore it.
Right.
And so, and that was a financial decision. This is like, well, this is how we're going to get noticed. this is how we're going to slowly, incrementally build a reputation for ourselves. A big turning point for us was a book in 2009 called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Yes.
I mean, again, anyone could have done this book. You know what I mean? Like, what we did was we took the public domain text of the Jane Austen novel, and then we hired a writer to enhance it with all new scenes of zombie mayhem and basically sort of integrate zombies into the narrative, which is actually a very easy thing to do because the book is already sort of set during wartime. Inexplicably, there are all these soldiers sort of roaming around that book, and if you don't have the context, it seems really weird.
Right.
So we did, the zombie war, and again, like the author was beside the point. What sold the book was the cover and the title and the concept, and so we did that for years and years.
It's a really interesting business model, but more so than that, for me, it's a really interesting creative model that you're sort of doing commissions, commissioning a work, and giving maybe a new or up and coming author a platform to work with some established editors. Someone's giving you an idea, and that's pretty good on the job training for a writer, I would think.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, and I want to say two things. One is that one of the most satisfying parts of my job is that I have been able to sort of help. I feel like launch some really well regarded authors, by giving them like their first chance. Like the author I just mentioned, the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies author, in 2008 when he was writing that book, he was a blogger. He was, and he just wrote the Lego Batman film that came out in February, and he's producing the It movie, the Stephen King adaptation that comes out next month.
Whoa.
So and that book basically blew up his career.
Yeah.
And he's a very talented writer. He's probably the funniest writer I know. He deserves all the success he got, but sometimes you got to get that break.
Exactly. Exactly. There's been so many times that authors have talked on this show about the role luck plays in getting that break. You can be the best writer in the world, you can have the best book in the world, but if no one discovers it, there's this thing that factors into it that none of us can explain, except if you've got a company like you guys who are kind of making luck happen for some folks. That's a pretty great thing.
Well, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I'll hear people talk about this all the time. Actors talk about it a lot too. I mean, sometimes you just have to get lucky. But one nice thing about being around, 17 years as opposed to 3 years is that the longer we're around, I actually don't have to work as hard. People send us stuff now.
Right.
Sure. So I don't have to, we don't actually commission as many books as we used to because we just get every day we get tons and tons of stuff from the outside world, and some of it's really good. So
I can't believe it's been almost 10 years since Pride and Prejudice and Zombies kind of got its start. That's pretty crazy. That kind of kicked off this when that book came out, and then I think you guys did Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. You started seeing all these other books come out where people were like, oh, we can take public domain stuff and do a mashup. And do you see that as a compliment when you see other people copying what you're doing, or does it get annoying?
No, I was mad. I'll tell you. I mean, 2008. I don't know if you remember. The economy was terrible in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So we were having a bad year along with everybody else, and also ebooks had just happened. I think so everyone's scared about that. People are like, oh, no one's going to read books anymore. And 2008, we had a miserable 2008. And then in April 2009, the zombies came along and they saved our butt, turned the whole bottom line around, and it was a miracle. And I thought, wow, this is great. I've got this thing. I can do this. I can do this for a few more years. We can do, because I had lists. I had a long list column A was like all the books you have to read in high school and college, you know, Great Expectations, Farewell to Arms, you know, and then my column on the right was things like robots, ninjas, zombies, and, you know, so I could mix and match anything. But I did not anticipate that because these things were in the public domain, anyone could do it,
right?
You know? And so sure enough, you know, like within weeks, if not days, you know, HarperCollins and Random House and all these other publishers were announcing, you know, Little Women and Werewolves. You know? The dumbest one, I think, was Mansfield Park and Mummies. You know, it's like, what? So
but nobody's tried Mansfield Park and Recreations.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah. It's probably a reason.
I as soon as I realized everyone else was going to do them, I was like, oh, you know, this thing won't even last a year. People are going to be, you know, people love it, and then all of a sudden they hate it, you know?
Right, saturation.
That stuff turns really fast, faster than ever nowadays, I think, with the internet.
Yeah. What about Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, that's probably if I ever work on a book that's bigger than that book, I'll be surprised. I mean, like that, you know, it's a trilogy, and I think we're over 9 million books. So, like, it's pretty insane. But it started with very modest expectations. I knew Ransom. He had done some little projects for us. He actually directed the book trailer for Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, which is still on YouTube. It's this very funny little movie. He's a filmmaker. He'd gone to film school, and he was going to write screenplays. And he directed this trailer for us where this woman gets dragged into a lake by a sea monster. And he did it all for like $4,000, and it looked amazing. And afterward, he wrote this very funny little essay about the making of the video, and I loved this essay. And I was like, you got to write something bigger. You know, what else? Do you have any ideas? And he came to me with these photos. He would collect photos from flea markets and swap meets, and they all had writing on the back. They were old photos, and then there'd be like a little note on the back. And he thought it'd be fun to do a collection of these photos and then show the back of the photo. And I didn't really like that idea because it seemed like an art book, and we weren't really doing art books. And then he's like, well, I have this other idea. He's like, what if we just did the photos of the weird kids, you know, and maybe I'll write like little Edward Gorey poems about them, like little rhyming couplets, like the Edward Gorey stuff. And that idea I loved because I love Edward Gorey. And I was like, yeah, go ahead, do that. And so for a long time, the working title was just Weird Kids. and I would keep getting these photos, and you knew they were real, you know? Nobody knew who these kids were or where these photos were taken or even who owned them, you know? But they were crazy, you know, like these kids in clown suits or, you know, just kids in top hats and monocles, but they just kind of look, or they're holding dolls, but back then, you know, there were no licensed characters, so the dolls looked really weird. And so I would read the poems, and, you know, we were going back and forth like for months in a way this is very organic, you know, like we were just like, you know, what if the kids all know each other? What if they all live in the same place? At some point it was decided that they lived in an orphanage or they went to school together, and I kept wanting more words. You know, I kept adding more words to this art book that we thought we were making. And then one day, finally, I said, you know, what I think I want is I want you to write a novel about these kids. And instead of an art book with mostly photos and a little bit of text, I think I want a word book. I want a lot of text and illustrate it with these photos. And I remember him saying, you know, I want the same thing, but I've been like too afraid to say it out loud. You know?
Oh, that's so cool.
And so at that point, I was like, well, look, let's do it. You know, go write the novel. I made him a deal on spec. You know, we gave him an advance to do it and a year to write the book. And then he came back with Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children.
Were you blown away when you got the book?
I was. Well, so here's the thing. I remember so now 2011, when that book came out, the iPad had just come out, and people were still really worried about reading and books. Nobody really wanted to get excited about anything. Borders had just gone out of business. The whole Borders chain was gone. So that publishing was like reeling. And so it was just hard to get people to be bullish about anything. And I remember getting the advances for Miss Peregrine from the printer, and I'm holding it in my hands. I'm like, this feels unprecedented and really cool and new. And I can't believe the world isn't making a bigger deal about this book, But I think it was really just the consequence of like when it was happening. It was sort of like the context of that time. And, maybe 2 weeks before the book came out, the internet sort of became aware of it, and it just exploded. And it debuted at number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list.
That is insane.
And it was very hard to get in stores because most people just hadn't really ordered it. So, but Amazon was selling tons of it.
It just kind of became a cultural phenomenon there for a while, didn't it?
Oh, I mean, it's been on the bestseller list since 2011.
That's insane.
And the movie just came out last September,
right?
And that really, once 20th Century Fox starts putting billboards with your book title on highways, I mean, then you really. I thought sales were high before, but then once they turn on that machine, my God, then you're really selling a lot of books.
Yeah, there's a recurring theme in your story that just you are in the right place at the right time with so much stuff, and it's I love hearing you talk about all of the exciting stuff that's going on with Quirk. But let's talk about your book for a minute. I love the hand that you've had in all these other things, but Impossible Fortress. Well, first off, let me say that I don't even know how I stumbled onto the book. I dig around a lot on Amazon and in bookstores. I'm always looking for new books and new authors and things like that. And I think I found it on a book list of most anticipated books of the summer, something like that. And I read the description, and I'm a big fan of Ready Player One and Ernie Klein, and that book did push so many buttons for me of nostalgia, and there's so many references in there that I got, and I love it for that. But the Impossible Fortress did something bigger than that for me, is in that it took me to that nostalgic place. But I realized that I am Billy, your main protagonist, and that's a whole different experience. The kind of the plot setup for it is intensely ludicrous, but absolutely something that I would have done when I was 14. Where did the idea for the book come from, and kind of how did you decide that you were going to write this book?
Sure. And I'll just let you know, like you're cutting it in and out a little bit over there. I think our connection might be suffering. But this story sort of, the roots of this book were, so I've been in Philadelphia for 20 years, but I grew up in this town in New Jersey. My dad got really sick a couple of years ago, and he started having a series of strokes, and it was really bad. Like for a couple months, he was having strokes and getting sicker and sicker. And I was going home a lot, and I was spending a lot of time just sort of sitting around in train stations and hospital waiting rooms. And I guess I was just feeling very nostalgic, I mean, I think that's what happens when you go home,
Right.
And so I felt like I wanted to write about, my teenage years, and my teenage years, as I mentioned earlier, were sort of defined by computer programming. So I knew I wanted to write about that, and I sort of wanted to write about the tedium of, my Friday and Saturday nights, which I would spend basically just typing in code from computer magazines that I bought. My kids will never know the agony of this, where to play a video game, you would buy a magazine with 12 pages of basic code, and if you typed it all in correctly, without making a single error, you'd have like this really primitive video game, and that's what I did for fun.
Or else you got syntax error, and then you go chase it down. Yeah,
the dreaded syntax error.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write about all that, and I wanted it to feel like the stories I liked in the 80s, like John Hughes movies and like 80s teen movies. I wanted it to feel very fast and funny. And I think, I was very cognizant of the fact that I was trying to make myself laugh. I wanted this to be a very buoyant book because I was just not like in a good place when I started doing it. And so, that was the spark of it. And, sadly, like my father passed away, like, after 3 months of being sick, and I went home, or rather back to Philadelphia. But I had the sort of start of this story, and I worked on it for the next 18 months. I'd work on it at night after I got home, after I put my kids to bed from like 9 to 11. I would sort of sit down at the kitchen table, and I loved it. I mean, it was the most fun I've ever had working on a project. It was like getting in a time machine to 1987 every night. And it felt like, there were a couple difficult nights, no doubt, that I've blacked out and I don't remember. But by and large, my memory of writing it it felt like play.
Were there any challenges in revisiting a time and reporting on it authentically, while at the same time making it relevant for today? I've tried to revisit that time in some of my writing, and I've just not pulled it off. It always feels very forced, or like I'm trying to include too many details, and it just gets kind of bogged down. But you do it so beautifully.
Oh, well, thanks. I don't know. I'll tell you, I'm a very insecure writer in that I don't think people have a lot of patience. You know what I mean?
True.
Like I am not somebody who, maybe, and I may sound different in this interview, but I'm not somebody who normally likes to hear the sound of my own voice. and so when I write, I'm constantly taking stuff out. I'm trying to strip everything I write down to like the barest essentials, and I'm always worried that people are going to get bored. So if there were any like superfluous details about 1980s life or anything like that, they probably just got cut by me because I was worried that people would only want so much,
Yeah. As a successful publisher who's had your hand in so many great successes, what was the feeling like for you in writing this long form piece? Kind of for the first time and putting your own name on it?
Well, so one thing is that, I've actually been writing books for, pretty much since I was in college. I mean, Impossible Fortune is actually the fifth book I've written. It's just the first book I actually showed anybody. The other four were, I just knew. Each one took maybe 2 or 3 years to finish, and then I have some that I didn't even finish. I had to waste a year on a project and then just shelve it. But I had 4 that I actually got all the way through. But then I just I knew that they just weren't doing whatever I need to do, and they were basically failed books, and so they're upstairs in a file cabinet. But when I finished Impossible Fortress, it was the first time I'd finished a book, and I still remember the moment when I was looking at it on my computer and looking for the next thing that I had to change, and then I was like, I don't think there's anything left. Like I think it's done, and it was the first time I'd ever felt that way. I was like, well, I don't know what else I would do to this. I think I've finally written a book that I could actually send out into the world, and it only took me 20 years to do it.
And what an awesome feeling that is. If someone's not familiar with the book, kind of what's the gist of it?
Well, so there are sort of 2 storylines. One is about the story on the surface. The sort of MacGuffin that kicks it in motion is that it's 1987. And the world is astonished because Wheel of Fortune hostess Vanna White is appearing in Playboy magazine. And, you remember, if you remember when this happened, this is a big deal. This was national news. It was all over the tabloids. And she filed this $5 million lawsuit to stop these photos from being printed. And so the boys in my book, it's before the internet. You cannot see these photos, but they must be seen. Surely if every adult in America is talking about them, they have to see them. They have to witness them firsthand, and they feel like these photos are going to unlock every secret they've ever wanted to know about women. And so they plan this elaborate scheme to break into their neighborhood newsstand and steal the magazine. So it's basically like a heist novel. The book actually has the structure of a heist novel for a very silly object of desire. But in the process of planning this heist, one of the boys meets this girl who works in the newsstand. It's sort of like an office supply shop with a newsstand, and they have some computers in the back, and they realize they have this sort of shared passion for computer programming, and they start working on this game together called The Impossible Fortress. And so over the course of the book, he sort of has two goals. He's trying to finish this game with this girl that he really likes, but then he has this other goal with his friends, and his loyalties get divided and things get very complicated very quickly.
As things do with 14-year-old boys.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to spoil what it is, but that twist in the third act, I did not see coming. I loved it. It was absolutely fantastic. You published the book with Simon Schuster. Were you tempted to publish it, with your company?
Yeah, I was, because it just seemed to me like such a Quirk book. Like it just. But here's the thing, it's my debut novel, and the way you sell a debut novel is to go out and scream to the world, this author's brilliant. This book is incredible. He's a visionary. And I just couldn't see making my employees do that. I think it would have just been like embarrassing. How would I do their annual review at the end of the year? I would like sit down and say, you didn't really spread the word about me and talk about how great I am enough, And so I just felt like, you know what, I want to keep this really clean. It's going to be like a church and state thing. I want it to be two separate parts of my life. Some other publisher can say it, but I don't want the people that, I see at the water cooler or in the kitchen at lunch every day having to do this. So, and a lot of writers, there are a lot of people in publishing who do similar things. I think it's actually very common.
Sure. Makes perfect sense. As a publisher and author, how has this experience changed kind of how you see the overview? It's been a really enlightening experience because Quirk is still a very small company. We've been around 17 years, and we are about a staff of like 20, And Simon & Schuster is a massive, massive company owned by CBS. And so, parts of the process are very similar in both places. Parts of the process are very different. And just being on the other side of the fence, I think, it's interesting being in an author's shoes. I think I probably have changed the way I do things a little bit just by the result of just going through the process. I think I'm probably a little more gentle with authors than I used to be. Handle them a little more delicately because I could clearly see them, I sensed they were doing that with me, and I sensed that they just sort of did it as like a matter of, I didn't think they were doing it special for me. I think could tell they did that with everyone. Right.
And they treated authors as if they had extremely fragile egos.
No, not writers. Fragile egos.
And I think I've been. So I'm trying to be a little more like that.
That's fantastic. So Are you working on a follow-up?
Yeah, I am. I'm sort of, in the middle of some big messy draft of another book that I want to do, and it's really premature to talk about what it is. But I have a lot written, and I'm hoping to finish, in maybe 6 or 8 months or something like that.
That's great. That's great. Well, Jason, I'm a huge fan of everything that you do. I cannot recommend The Impossible Fortress enough, and everything that you're doing at Quirk. I love what you do, and thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thank you, Hank. It's a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise headless and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth, the nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.